Before we talk about the shocking crime, let's first understand who was involved. This case revolves around a powerful tech CEO and his secretary, whose secret relationship took a deadly turn. The CEO was a well-respected businessman, known for his sharp mind and leadership. He built a multi-million-dollar company, earning the trust of investors and employees. To the public, he appeared successful, disciplined, and untouchable. But behind closed doors, he had a secret life. His secretary was a hard-working and ambitious woman. She managed a schedule, handled confidential matters, and was always by his side. Colleagues noticed their close relationship, but no one suspected how deep it truly was. What started as a professional connection turned into something much more dangerous. Little did they know, their secret wouldn't stay hidden forever. Before we talk about the affair that led to the crime, it's important to understand the two main figures in this tragic story. First, let's take a look at the tech CEO, a man who seemed to have it all. He was the founder and leader of a rapidly growing tech company. Known for his sharp intellect, his ability to predict market trends, and his relentless drive, the CEO was a force to be reckoned with in the tech industry. From the outside, his life appeared perfect: a successful business, a strong reputation, and a secure place among the most powerful individuals in the world of technology. But beneath this image of success, there was a more complicated side to his personality. The CEO had a charm that drew people in, but it also meant he could easily manipulate situations to his advantage. He had a history of risky decisions and questionable moral choices, and as his power grew, so did his ability to hide his true nature. He had a private life that few people knew about. On the surface, his personal life appeared to be in order, with a family and a well-maintained public image. Yet, as we've seen in many cases of high-profile figures, the more a person has to lose, the harder it becomes to maintain that image. His actions behind the scenes became harder to control, and it wasn't long before his dark side began to creep into his professional world. At the center of this tale was his secretary, a woman in her late 20s. She had joined the company shortly after graduating from college, eager to start her career and make her mark in the business world. Intelligent and driven, she quickly became an invaluable asset to the CEO. She was highly organized, managing his schedule, handling sensitive documents, and ensuring the smooth operation of his day-to-day activities. It didn't take long for her to gain the trust of her boss, who appreciated her dedication and efficiency. Their working relationship, however, soon became more personal. The secretary had admired her boss from the moment she started working at the company. She respected his success and intelligence. But what began as professional admiration slowly evolved into something deeper. The CEO, aware of her admiration, seemed to enjoy the attention, and what started as occasional conversations about work slowly grew into more intimate discussions. She was drawn to his power and influence, and he, in turn, enjoyed the feeling of being desired. The more time they spent together, the more they began to confide in each other, sharing personal stories, frustrations, and hopes. For the secretary, it felt as though she was being given access to a world that few others were allowed into, a world of power, luxury, and opportunity. As their connection deepened, the lines between professionalism and personal attraction began to blur. The CEO was known for his charismatic leadership, but he was also known for his secrecy. His personal life was a mystery to many, but his close relationship with his secretary started to raise eyebrows. What started as a flirtation between two adults turned into a full-fledged affair, hidden from the public eye. Despite their growing connection, both individuals understood the risk they were taking. The secretary was aware that any public discovery of their relationship could ruin both their careers. For the CEO, there was more at stake: his reputation, his marriage, and his position within the company. The affair, if exposed, could destroy everything he had built. Still, despite the risks, they continued the relationship. They met in private, sometimes in the CEO's office after hours, other times at luxury hotels away from the prying eyes of the media. The secrecy of it all seemed to fuel their passion, creating a sense of excitement and danger. They lived in a world where appearances mattered, and their relationship was one that could never be revealed. As the affair continued, the secretary began to see a different side of the CEO. While his public persona was one of control and confidence, in private, he displayed a more vulnerable side. He confided in her about the pressures of running a multi-million-dollar company, the loneliness that came with being at the top, and the struggles of maintaining the perfect image. For the secretary, this was a side of him that few ever saw, and it made her feel special, like she was the only one who truly understood him. But despite this closeness, the relationship was also marked by tension. The CEO was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he could be controlling, manipulative, and even cruel. He demanded loyalty and had high expectations of those around him. The secretary, for all her intelligence and ambition, began to realize that she was not as powerful in the relationship as she had once believed. She felt trapped, torn between her emotions and the reality of the situation. In the meantime, the CEO's wife, a well-known figure in the community, remained unaware of the affair. She was supportive of her husband's career and public endeavors, but their marriage had long been marked by distance. They lived separate lives, each consumed by their respective responsibilities. She trusted her husband, never suspecting that his relationship with his secretary had turned into something far more than professional. For the CEO, the affair was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided him with a sense of validation and excitement that his marriage lacked. On the other hand, it came with the constant fear of being exposed. As the relationship grew more intense, so did his fear of losing control. The secretary had become too important to him, and he could not afford to let her go, nor could he let the affair become public. He had too much to lose. The secretary, though, began to struggle with the emotional toll of the relationship. She had started out seeing the CEO as a mentor, someone she admired for his success and drive. But now, as the affair grew more intense, she found herself caught between her emotions and the reality of what she was involved in. She started to question whether she was truly in control of the situation, or if she was simply another one of the CEO's many victims. Their secret world, once exciting and thrilling, began to feel like a cage. The weight of their deceit began to take its toll, and both of them started to realize that there were no easy ways out. Before we talk about how the affair was discovered, it's important to understand the nature of the relationship between the CEO and his secretary. What began as a professional connection between two ambitious individuals soon evolved into something far more intimate, dangerous, and hidden. The affair was not just about a brief romantic fling. It became an essential part of their lives, something that both tried to protect from the world around them, despite the growing risks. In the early stages, the CEO and his secretary kept things strictly professional. Their conversations were about work, with the secretary managing the CEO's daily schedule, coordinating meetings, and handling sensitive corporate matters. The dynamic was one of mutual respect, with the secretary earning the CEO's trust through her efficiency and reliability. But as time went on, the boundaries between professionalism and personal feelings began to blur. The first signs of attraction were subtle. The CEO, a man used to being in control of every aspect of his life, began to rely more and more on his secretary for emotional support. It started with small exchanges, an unexpected compliment on her appearance, an offhand remark about how much he valued her help. For the secretary, these gestures were flattering, and slowly, she found herself drawn to him. He was not just her boss. He was a powerful, successful figure, and she admired him deeply. There was something magnetic about his presence, his confidence, his intellect, and his ability to command respect from everyone around him. For the CEO, the attraction was both a source of pleasure and anxiety. On one hand, he enjoyed the attention and admiration from his secretary. It made him feel desired and powerful, something that added to his already inflated ego. On the other hand, he knew that crossing the line with her could lead to disaster. He had a family, a wife who trusted him, and a public image to maintain. The pressure of his double life began to build, but despite the risks, he couldn't resist. The secretary, too, felt the pull. What started as innocent flirtation grew into something more intense, a secret that neither of them wanted to let go of. As their relationship deepened, the secrecy surrounding it became more pronounced. They started meeting after hours in the CEO's office, or occasionally at private locations, away from the eyes of the company's employees and the outside world. These were moments of escape, where they could let their guard down and indulge in their desires without fear of discovery. For the secretary, the affair was thrilling, an escape from the pressures of her ordinary life into a world of power and forbidden intimacy. For the CEO, it was a dangerous temptation that offered him a sense of excitement that his marriage no longer provided. But there were complications. As the affair continued, both began to realize the stakes involved. For the secretary, the relationship was more than just a fling. She had developed strong feelings for the CEO. She started to imagine a future with him, even though she knew the consequences of such a fantasy. The CEO, on the other hand, was still deeply entrenched in his marriage. His wife, a well-known public figure in the business world, was completely unaware of the affair. He had managed to keep up the charade of a perfect family life, and exposing the truth would shatter everything he had worked so hard to build. Still, the relationship grew more intense. The CEO would often confide in his secretary about his struggles at work, the pressures of running a tech empire, and the stress of maintaining his public image. For her, these moments were powerful. She felt like the only person who truly understood him, the only one who saw him for who he really was. They shared their hopes, their fears, and their frustrations, creating a bond that went beyond mere physical attraction. But despite the emotional closeness, the affair was far from perfect. The secretary began to feel a sense of unease. She started to question the sincerity of the CEO's feelings. Was he truly in love with her, or was she just a convenient outlet for his desires? She began to see signs that he was growing more distant, pulling away when she needed reassurance. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that the CEO was a powerful man, a man with the ability to make her life both incredibly rewarding and incredibly dangerous. For the CEO, the affair was a constant balancing act. He enjoyed the passion and intimacy he found with his secretary, but he also feared the consequences if their secret were to get out. He started to worry about his wife, who had become suspicious in recent months. She noticed his growing distraction, his late nights at the office, and the frequent, unexplained absences. While she had never confronted him directly, there was a growing tension in their marriage, a sense that something was not quite right. The CEO's fears were well-founded. His secretary, though, was becoming increasingly unsettled as well. She wanted more than just secrecy. She wanted a future. But that future seemed impossible in the context of their relationship. She was aware that she was not the only person in the CEO's life, and as much as she wanted to believe in their love, she couldn't escape the reality that he had a wife, a family, and an entire public life to protect. The secretary, too, was caught in a web of deception, torn between her emotions and the harsh reality of the situation. Despite these concerns, neither of them could stop the affair. The danger only made it more thrilling, and the secrecy added an element of excitement. But with each passing day, the tension continued to build. The more they tried to hide their feelings, the more their connection seemed to grow. For the CEO, the affair had become a source of control and escape. For the secretary, it was a dangerous game of power, one that left her questioning her own worth and the future she had once imagined. At the same time, both were keenly aware of the risk they were taking. The CEO, despite his outward confidence, was constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when someone would find out. The secretary, though deeply entangled in the relationship, couldn't ignore the fact that the CEO's world was crumbling beneath the weight of their secret. They were both playing a high-stakes game, with everything to lose and nothing to gain but the fleeting moments of passion they shared behind closed doors. But the affair was destined to reach its breaking point, a point where the consequences would no longer be avoidable. Before we talk about how the affair was discovered, it's important to understand the nature of the relationship between the CEO and his secretary. What began as a professional connection between two ambitious individuals soon evolved into something far more intimate, dangerous, and hidden. The affair was not just about a brief romantic fling. It became an essential part of their lives, something that both tried to protect from the world around them, despite the growing risks. In the early stages, the CEO and his secretary kept things strictly professional. Their conversations were about work, with the secretary managing the CEO's daily schedule, coordinating meetings, and handling sensitive corporate matters. The dynamic was one of mutual respect, with the secretary earning the CEO's trust through her efficiency and reliability. But as time went on, the boundaries between professionalism and personal feelings began to blur. The first signs of attraction were subtle. The CEO, a man used to being in control of every aspect of his life, began to rely more and more on his secretary for emotional support. It started with small exchanges, an unexpected compliment on her appearance, an offhand remark about how much he valued her help. For the secretary, these gestures were flattering, and slowly, she found herself drawn to him. He was not just her boss. He was a powerful, successful figure, and she admired him deeply. There was something magnetic about his presence, his confidence, his intellect, and his ability to command respect from everyone around him. For the CEO, the attraction was both a source of pleasure and anxiety. On one hand, he enjoyed the attention and admiration from his secretary. It made him feel desired and powerful, something that added to his already inflated ego. On the other hand, he knew that crossing the line with her could lead to disaster. He had a family, a wife who trusted him, and a public image to maintain. The pressure of his double life began to build, but despite the risks, he couldn't resist. The secretary, too, felt the pull. What started as innocent flirtation grew into something more intense, a secret that neither of them wanted to let go of. As their relationship deepened, the secrecy surrounding it became more pronounced. They started meeting after hours in the CEO's office, or occasionally at private locations, away from the eyes of the company's employees and the outside world. These were moments of escape, where they could let their guard down and indulge in their desires without fear of discovery. For the secretary, the affair was thrilling, an escape from the pressures of her ordinary life into a world of power and forbidden intimacy. For the CEO, it was a dangerous temptation that offered him a sense of excitement that his marriage no longer provided. But there were complications. As the affair continued, both began to realize the stakes involved. For the secretary, the relationship was more than just a fling. She had developed strong feelings for the CEO. She started to imagine a future with him, even though she knew the consequences of such a fantasy. The CEO, on the other hand, was still deeply entrenched in his marriage. His wife, a well-known public figure in the business world, was completely unaware of the affair. He had managed to keep up the charade of a perfect family life, and exposing the truth would shatter everything he had worked so hard to build. Still, the relationship grew more intense. The CEO would often confide in his secretary about his struggles at work, the pressures of running a tech empire, and the stress of maintaining his public image. For her, these moments were powerful. She felt like the only person who truly understood him, the only one who saw him for who he really was. They shared their hopes, their fears, and their frustrations, creating a bond that went beyond mere physical attraction. But despite the emotional closeness, the affair was far from perfect. The secretary began to feel a sense of unease. She started to question the sincerity of the CEO's feelings. Was he truly in love with her, or was she just a convenient outlet for his desires? She began to see signs that he was growing more distant, pulling away when she needed reassurance. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that the CEO was a powerful man, a man with the ability to make her life both incredibly rewarding and incredibly dangerous. For the CEO, the affair was a constant balancing act. He enjoyed the passion and intimacy he found with his secretary, but he also feared the consequences if their secret were to get out. He started to worry about his wife, who had become suspicious in recent months. She noticed his growing distraction, his late nights at the office, and the frequent, unexplained absences. While she had never confronted him directly, there was a growing tension in their marriage, a sense that something was not quite right. The CEO's fears were well-founded. His secretary, though, was becoming increasingly unsettled as well. She wanted more than just secrecy. She wanted a future. But that future seemed impossible in the context of their relationship. She was aware that she was not the only person in the CEO's life, and as much as she wanted to believe in their love, she couldn't escape the reality that he had a wife, a family, and an entire public life to protect. The secretary, too, was caught in a web of deception, torn between her emotions and the harsh reality of the situation. Despite these concerns, neither of them could stop the affair. The danger only made it more thrilling, and the secrecy added an element of excitement. But with each passing day, the tension continued to build. The more they tried to hide their feelings, the more their connection seemed to grow. For the CEO, the affair had become a source of control and escape. For the secretary, it was a dangerous game of power, one that left her questioning her own worth and the future she had once imagined. At the same time, both were keenly aware of the risk they were taking. The CEO, despite his outward confidence, was constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when someone would find out. The secretary, though deeply entangled in the relationship, couldn't ignore the fact that the CEO's world was crumbling beneath the weight of their secret. They were both playing a high-stakes game, with everything to lose and nothing to gain but the fleeting moments of passion they shared behind closed doors. But the affair was destined to reach its breaking point, a point where the consequences would no longer be avoidable. Before we talk about the moment the affair was exposed, it's crucial to understand how it remained hidden for as long as it did. The CEO and his secretary were careful, meticulous in covering their tracks, and seemingly immune to suspicion. But no secret can stay buried forever, especially when the stakes are this high. Over time, small cracks began to appear in their carefully constructed world, unnoticed by them, but inevitable in hindsight. Their world of hidden meetings, stolen moments, and whispered promises was bound to crumble. The first real sign that something was amiss came not from a CEO's wife, but from a colleague at the company. A junior executive, who had worked closely with both the CEO and the secretary, began to notice subtle shifts in their behavior. The CEO, a man known for his high standards and unwavering professionalism, started to act differently. He was distracted in meetings, his focus often drifting to his phone, where his secretary would message him, sometimes during the workday. There were instances when the CEO seemed unusually distant, as though preoccupied with something that wasn't related to the business at hand. The secretary, too, had begun acting oddly. Though she had always been a composed and organized individual, there were days when she seemed nervous, almost jittery. Colleagues observed her fidgeting when the CEO's name was mentioned in casual conversation, her eyes darting toward the door whenever someone knocked. She was no longer her usual self, confident, efficient, and in control. Instead, she appeared unsettled, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to discover the truth. Despite these signs, no one dared to directly confront either the CEO or the secretary. They were both highly influential figures within the company, and any challenge to their authority could have serious consequences. But the whispers began, quietly at first, then with growing certainty. The affair wasn't a matter of if it would be discovered, but when. For the secretary, the fear of discovery grew with each passing day. She had always believed she was in control of the situation, that she could keep her personal and professional lives separate. But the more time she spent with the CEO, the more she realized how fragile their secret really was. She began to feel the weight of their actions pressing down on her, knowing that one slip-up could expose everything. Every time she texted him or arranged a meeting, she feared someone would see, overhear, or catch them in the act. The thrill of the affair had started to feel less like an exciting adventure and more like a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, the CEO continued to live his double life, carefully compartmentalizing his work and personal affairs. He convinced himself that as long as he maintained control over both his company and his family, the secret affair would remain hidden. But the pressure was beginning to show. He would frequently snap at his staff over minor issues, something that was unlike him. He began to miss meetings or arrive late, offering vague excuses. His attention was scattered, and his mind was constantly preoccupied with the growing fear that his carefully curated life was about to unravel. It was the CEO's wife, however, who would ultimately become the first person to uncover the truth. For months, she had suspected that something was wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She had noticed the late nights at the office, the unexplained absences, and his sudden detachment from their relationship. He had always been a busy man, but the change in his behavior was undeniable. She had asked him about it on several occasions, but he always assured her it was work-related stress. She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. Her intuition was telling her that her husband's infidelity was the root of the problem. It all came to a head one evening when the CEO was supposed to attend a charity event with his wife. He had promised to be there, but at the last minute, he claimed to have an urgent business meeting that required his presence. His wife, now increasingly suspicious, decided to follow him. She had hired a private investigator some weeks earlier, and her suspicions were confirmed when an investigator reported that the CEO had been seen entering a hotel with his secretary. The confirmation hit her like a tidal wave. All the doubts she had carried for months were now undeniable truths. She had always trusted her husband, but in that moment, she realized how much she had overlooked. The affair wasn't just some distant possibility. It was happening right under her nose, and her husband had been lying to her the entire time. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, and yet, she knew that confronting him would only add more fuel to the fire. As for the secretary, she had no idea that her world was about to collapse. She was still under the illusion that their secret was safe, that no one knew about the affair. But when the CEO's wife confronted her with the evidence, it became clear that the truth was out. She had never imagined that things would escalate so quickly, and she found herself caught in a storm that she couldn't escape. The confrontation between the CEO's wife and the secretary was both public and private. The wife didn't just confront the secretary in a quiet, intimate setting. She made sure that it would be witnessed by others. It was a statement, a final moment of power before everything fell apart. The secretary, faced with the undeniable truth, could only stand there in shock. She had never thought it would come to this. Her affair with the CEO exposed for the world to see. The CEO, upon hearing the news of his wife's discovery, attempted to smooth things over. He tried to convince his wife that it was a one-time mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But the damage was done. His wife was devastated, unable to believe the man she had trusted for so long could betray her so deeply. The company, too, began to take notice of the tension surrounding their leader. Rumors spread quickly, and it wasn't long before employees started whispering about the CEO's infidelity. But the affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It had professional consequences as well. The secretary had become a liability, not just to the CEO, but to the entire company. The more people knew about the affair, the more it tarnished the company's reputation. There were talks of board meetings, legal ramifications, and the possibility of an investigation into the CEO's actions. What had once been a private matter between two individuals was now a public scandal with far-reaching consequences. As the truth began to spread, both the CEO and the secretary found themselves in a race to protect what was left of their lives. The CEO, desperate to salvage his marriage and his business, tried to convince his wife to forgive him, to move past the affair. But his wife was resolute, unwilling to ignore the truth any longer. The secretary, too, had to reckon with the fact that the life she had imagined with the CEO was now out of reach. The discovery of the affair marked the beginning of the end for both of them. The careful facade they had built had shattered, and the fallout was just beginning. What had once been a secret that they believed could never be uncovered was now a reality that neither of them could escape. Before we talk about the legal consequences and the fallout from the murder, it's important to understand the whirlwind that followed the discovery of the crime. The murder of the secretary by the CEO had sent shockwaves through the company, the tech industry, and beyond. What had begun as a hidden affair now spiraled into a full-blown public scandal that would affect not only the CEO's life, but also the lives of everyone around him. The event marked the beginning of a long and painful legal journey, as well as a profound shift in the public's perception of the once-admired businessman. After the body of the secretary was discovered, the authorities quickly launched an investigation into her death. The initial shock of the murder soon gave way to a chilling realization. The man who had once been seen as a symbol of success and innovation was now the prime suspect. The CEO, whose high-profile reputation had once been the envy of his peers, was now facing accusations of premeditated murder. The investigation was swift, with the police focusing their efforts on the CEO's role in the secretary's death. Forensic evidence began to point to him, and his actions in the aftermath of the crime only raised more questions. The first sign that the CEO's situation was becoming dire came when the police obtained video footage from the security cameras inside the building. The footage showed the CEO entering his office with the secretary, but it didn't capture the exact moment of the murder. However, what it did reveal was disturbing. The CEO had been in his office alone with her for hours, and there was no evidence of anyone else being present. This footage, though not conclusive on its own, raised suspicion and set the stage for a more detailed investigation. As the investigation progressed, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The police discovered that the CEO had made several attempts to cover up the murder. He had initially tried to make it appear as though a struggle had occurred, but the physical evidence did not support his story. No signs of forced entry were found, and the position of the secretary's body suggested that the killing had been a deliberate act. It became clear that the CEO had planned to eliminate her to protect his secrets. In addition to the evidence at the crime scene, investigators uncovered incriminating text messages between the CEO and the secretary, confirming their illicit affair and painting a picture of a man desperate to protect his empire at any cost. Once the CEO was arrested, the legal system took over. The first step in the process was his arraignment, where he was formally charged with the murder of his secretary. The news of the arrest spread quickly, and soon, every media outlet was covering the story. The CEO, once a beloved public figure, was now portrayed as a cold-blooded killer. His family, who had once enjoyed a life of luxury and privacy, was thrust into the spotlight. His wife, already dealing with the devastation of the affair, now had to contend with the fact that her husband had committed murder. She was faced with the impossible task of reconciling the man she thought she knew with the man now accused of such a heinous crime. In the court of public opinion, the CEO's downfall was swift and unforgiving. Once the story broke, social media exploded with outrage. People were shocked, not just by the murder itself, but by the fact that it had been committed by a man who had once been admired for his intellect and business acumen. The affair had been one thing, but the murder was another entirely. Public figures who had once praised the CEO now distanced themselves from him, unwilling to be associated with someone involved in such a brutal act. The public's trust in him, built over years of successful ventures and innovations, was shattered in an instant. As the legal proceedings began, the CEO's defense team worked tirelessly to build a case. They argued that the murder had been a momentary lapse in judgment, a crime of passion fueled by the stress of the affair and the consequences of its exposure. They tried to paint the CEO as a man who had been pushed to the edge, a man whose entire life was collapsing before him. They attempted to portray the secretary as someone who had contributed to the unraveling of the CEO's life, arguing that her insistence on continuing the affair, even after it was discovered, had driven the CEO to a breaking point. But the prosecution's case was much stronger. They painted a picture of premeditation, of a man who had intentionally planned to eliminate a person who had become a threat to his carefully constructed world. The evidence of the CEO's cover-up, combined with the incriminating messages, left little doubt in the minds of the jury that the murder had not been a spontaneous act, but a calculated decision. The prosecution also highlighted the power dynamics at play. A man in a position of immense authority who felt entitled to control every aspect of his life, even at the expense of others. The secretary, they argued, had been nothing more than a pawn in his game of power. The trial was a spectacle, drawing media attention from around the world. The details of the CEO's affair, his manipulation of those around him, and the violent end he brought to his secretary's life were laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The CEO, once a commanding presence in the business world, now sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges that could lead to a life sentence in prison. As the trial progressed, more witnesses were called to the stand. Employees from the company, once loyal to the CEO, testified about his behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. They spoke of his increasing erratic behavior, his growing paranoia, and his attempts to hide his personal life from the public. These testimonies painted a picture of a man who had been spiraling out of control, consumed by his own secrets and the fear of losing everything he had worked for. In the end, the jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict. The CEO was convicted of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence marked the end of the CEO's once promising career. The man who had built an empire with his intellect and vision was now a criminal, his future irrevocably altered by the choices he had made. The public fallout continued long after the trial had ended. The company, now without its leader, struggled to regain its footing. The investors who had once backed the CEO withdrew their support, and the company's stock plummeted. The employees, many of whom had remained loyal to the CEO throughout the scandal, were left to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild the company from the ground up. The tech world, once eager to embrace the innovations the CEO had brought to the table, now turned its back on him. The CEO's family, too, had to grapple with the consequences of his actions. His wife, who had been blindsided by the affair and the murder, was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. She faced the challenge of moving forward, both personally and financially, after her husband's imprisonment. The impact of the CEO's actions stretched far beyond the courtroom, leaving lasting scars on his family, his company, and the industry he had once dominated. Before we talk about how the affair spiraled into tragedy, it's important to understand emotional turmoil and the dangerous corner the CEO had backed himself into. As the affair came to light, the CEO's entire world began to unravel. He had long maintained the illusion of control, but now everything was slipping through his fingers. His marriage was on the brink of collapse, and his reputation was in ruins. The company he had spent years building was at risk of being torn apart by the scandal, and his personal life was in chaos. The pressure, coupled with the fear of losing everything, became too much for him to bear. In the aftermath of the affair being discovered, the CEO's actions became increasingly erratic. He had always been a man used to power, to having the upper hand in every situation. Now, though, he found himself at the mercy of the consequences of his own decisions. His wife, devastated and angry, was no longer willing to tolerate the betrayal. She made it clear that she would file for divorce, citing the affair as the reason for the breakdown of their marriage. This was something the CEO couldn't allow. A divorce would not only destroy his family, but also strip him of his social standing and financial power. His public image would be shattered, and the company's investors would lose faith in him. Everything he had worked for would collapse. But it wasn't just the divorce that terrified him. His secretary, the woman with whom he had once shared a passionate affair, had become a liability. In the chaos of the exposure, she became a symbol of his failure, a reminder of the reckless decisions that had led him to this point. To the CEO, it became clear that she was no longer a partner in the secret world they had shared. She was now a threat to his survival. If she spoke out, if she revealed more details about their relationship, it could lead to further scandal and legal trouble. He couldn't allow that to happen. The secretary, for her part, was overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events. She had once been the trusted confidant of a powerful man, but now she was caught in a web of betrayal and fear. She had hoped that their relationship might one day lead to something more, that the CEO would leave his wife and build a life with her. But as the affair unraveled, she realized that she had been nothing more than a pawn in the CEO's dangerous game. Her future was uncertain, and she knew that whatever came next could either destroy her career or cast her as the villain in a scandal that had taken on a life of its own. It was during this time of heightened tension and fear that the CEO made the fateful decision to act. The pressure had become unbearable. He couldn't face the humiliation of a public scandal, nor could he live with the constant fear of losing everything. His secretary, who had once been his lover, had now become a liability that he couldn't afford. Her very existence threatened the delicate balance he had worked so hard to maintain. One evening, as the secretary prepared to leave the office, the CEO made his move. He had invited her to his office under the guise of discussing the future of the company. She had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. She had come to believe that the CEO was simply dealing with the fallout from their affair, trying to make amends in some way. But as she entered the office, she was met not with words of reconciliation, but with an overwhelming sense of danger. The CEO, in a moment of utter desperation, confronted her. His words were cold, calculated, and full of the venom that had built up over the course of their affair. The secretary, shocked and confused, tried to reason with him. She never imagined that things would escalate this far. The tension between them, however, quickly turned into a physical altercation. Words were exchanged, accusations flew, and in a moment of rage, the CEO made a split-second decision that would change everything. The secretary, struggling to defend herself, became a victim of the CEO's desperation. He had always been a man used to getting his way, and in that moment, he felt as though he had no other option. The attack was swift and brutal. In the end, the secretary's life was tragically cut short in the very place where she had once been an essential part of the CEO's world. Her body was found hours later, lifeless and cold, a grim reminder of the lengths to which the CEO was willing to go to protect his secrets. After the murder, the CEO tried to cover his tracks. He attempted to stage the scene to make it appear as though something had gone wrong in a struggle. But the details didn't add up. The authorities, alerted by the discovery of the body, began their investigation. They found inconsistencies in the CEO's story, and the evidence slowly began to point toward him. The forensic evidence was damning, and the motive for the crime became clear. A desperate man trying to hide his past, protect his future, and avoid the destruction of his empire. The murder sent shockwaves through the company. Employees who had once admired the CEO now found themselves grappling with the reality that their leader was capable of such violence. The company's reputation, already tainted by the scandal of the affair, now faced an even greater threat. Investors pulled their support, and the board of directors moved to have the CEO removed from his position. The company, once a powerhouse in the tech industry, was now on the brink of collapse. As for the CEO, his life had changed forever. He was arrested and charged with the murder of his secretary. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with the media covering every aspect of the case. The public's perception of him shifted from that of a powerful businessman to that of a ruthless killer. The man who had once been admired for his success was now viewed as a cautionary tale, a man undone by his own greed, his own lies, and his own dark desires. The murder of the secretary marked the tragic end of what had once been a promising relationship. What began as a secret affair between two individuals with power, ambition, and desire ended in violence, betrayal, and death. The CEO, in his attempt to protect his empire, had destroyed everything he held dear, including his own life. The secretary, whose only mistake was falling for a man whose promises were empty, paid the ultimate price. In the aftermath, the company struggled to recover from a scandal, and the CEO's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. His wife, once willing to forgive him for the affair, now faced the unthinkable. The man she had loved had not only betrayed her, but had taken the life of another. The consequences of the CEO's actions reached far beyond the walls of his office. The impact of the murder would ripple through every aspect of his life, and the lives of those around him for years to come. The murder and its aftermath were a stark reminder of how a moment of poor judgment, fueled by greed and desperation, could have devastating consequences. The once revered CEO, now a convicted murderer, would forever be remembered not for his achievements in the tech world, but for the crime that brought his empire crashing down. Before we talk about the broader implications of the CEO's actions on the tech industry and corporate culture, it's essential to consider just how profoundly one individual's choices can reverberate throughout an entire sector. The tech world, often viewed as a symbol of progress, innovation, and forward-thinking leadership, was thrown into disarray by the shocking events surrounding the CEO's murder of his secretary. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was an event that shook the foundation of corporate ethics and business practices within the industry. At its core, the murder was a tragic reminder of the pressures that top executives often face, the complex dynamics of power within high-stakes environments, and the dark side of ambition. The CEO, once a shining example of what a successful entrepreneur could achieve, had become a cautionary tale. His actions not only destroyed a life, but also shattered the trust investors, employees, and the public had placed in the technology sector. As details of the murder unfolded, the public began to question the very values that drove the leaders of the tech world. The immediate aftermath of the scandal left the tech company at the center of a storm. In addition to the public outcry, the company's stock value plummeted, reflecting the loss of confidence investors had in its leadership. The reputation of the CEO, once seen as a visionary, was tarnished beyond repair. His decisions, from the affair to the violent end of his secretary, had proven that the ruthless pursuit of success could come at a deadly cost. The company, which had once thrived under his leadership, now found itself struggling to stay afloat as it faced mounting legal battles, loss of business partners, and an uncertain future. The impact of the CEO's actions wasn't confined to just one company or one individual. It reverberated across the entire tech industry. Investors who had once been eager to pour money into high-growth tech startups began to second-guess their decisions. The image of the tech CEO as a responsible, forward-thinking leader was fractured. The murder exposed the dark side of corporate life, greed, manipulation, and the abuse of power. Many began to wonder if these were not just isolated incidents, but symptoms of a larger problem that existed within the industry. In the wake of the murder, industry leaders, particularly those in positions of power, faced intense scrutiny. The events surrounding the CEO's downfall became a case study in corporate ethics, leadership failure, and the pressure to maintain an image of success. Critics of the tech industry pointed out that many of the sector's leading figures had become increasingly disconnected from the real-world consequences of their actions. The CEO's story was seen as a stark example of how unchecked power could lead to moral decay and disastrous results. The consequences of a scandal were felt by tech companies far beyond the one at the heart of the case. Investors who had been hesitant to place their money in tech startups before the murder were now even more cautious. Many took a step back, reevaluating their portfolios and looking for safer, more predictable industries. The murder caused them to question whether the business world they had once trusted was as stable as it seemed. The tech sector, which had been booming for years, found itself facing a period of uncertainty as investors hesitated to pour money into companies with leaders who had proven to be capable of such extreme actions. For many employees within the tech industry, the CEO's actions served as a harsh wake-up call. Employees at the CEO's company and others throughout the industry were forced to confront the toxic environments that could develop within high-powered corporations. The murder not only revealed a personal moral failure, but also exposed systemic issues within the corporate culture. Employees began to question whether their work environments were healthy or whether they, too, were complicit in fostering cultures of ambition and secrecy that could lead to such tragic outcomes. Many started to demand greater transparency and accountability from the companies they worked for, advocating for corporate cultures that valued ethics and empathy over profit at all costs. In the aftermath, a larger conversation emerged about the role of corporate leadership in shaping not only a company's success, but its ethical framework. The tech industry, with its rapid growth and relentless pursuit of innovation, had often been criticized for a lack of focus on the human cost of its achievements. The murder served as a stark reminder that the pursuit of success could not come at the expense of the well-being of individuals. It sparked a broader conversation about the responsibility of leaders to create not just profitable companies, but ethical, compassionate workplaces that prioritize the welfare of employees and stakeholders. This shift in corporate culture began to manifest in various ways. Many companies started to implement stricter codes of conduct and ethical guidelines, recognizing the need to establish boundaries that would prevent abuses of power. Leaders in the tech industry became more vocal about the importance of empathy, emotional intelligence, and ethical decision-making in leadership. The murder had exposed the dangers of unchecked ambition, and companies sought to avoid following the same path by implementing new programs focused on leadership training, mental health support, and employee well-being. The scandal also led to increased scrutiny of corporate governance. Shareholders, regulators, and the public began demanding greater accountability from companies, especially in regard to the behavior of their top executives. Corporate governance practices, which had often been criticized for being too lenient and focused on short-term profits, were re-examined. Many companies took steps to improve transparency, creating more robust systems of checks and balances to ensure that power remained in the hands of those who could be trusted to wield it responsibly. In the wake of the murder, there was also a noticeable shift in the kinds of leaders who were being celebrated in the tech world. No longer were only the self-made billionaires and high-powered executives lauded as role models. Now, there was greater appreciation for those who demonstrated ethical leadership and a commitment to fostering healthy, supportive corporate cultures. As the dust settled, the industry began to realize that it wasn't enough to simply be successful. It was necessary to be successful in a way that was sustainable, humane, and responsible. Moreover, the scandal brought attention to the increasing concentration of power in the hands of tech executives. As the CEO's actions illustrated, leaders who held too much power within their companies could become detached from the realities of their decisions. The murder highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for greater checks and balances in corporate hierarchies. It sparked conversations about corporate structure, including the need for stronger oversight from boards of directors and greater input from employees at all levels of the organization. The tech industry, having prided itself on being a disruptor of traditional business models, now found itself facing its own disruption. The murder forced many to reevaluate what they valued as a sector and what it meant to be a successful leader. It prompted a more significant focus on integrity, human-centered leadership, and the importance of creating workplace cultures that place people before profits. Ultimately, the murder of the secretary at the hands of the CEO was not just a personal tragedy, but a moment of reckoning for the tech industry. The event laid bare the darker side of corporate culture, revealing the toxic dynamics that can exist within organizations that prioritize success above all else. It sparked a shift in the industry's values, pushing leaders and companies to rethink what kind of corporate culture they wanted to foster moving forward. The legacy of the tragedy would linger for years, as the industry sought to learn from its mistakes and build a more ethical, compassionate future. Before we talk about the role of media in shaping public perception, it's essential to recognize how powerful the media can be when it comes to framing a narrative. In the case of the CEO's murder of his secretary, the media played an instrumental role in determining how the story was perceived by the public. It wasn't just the crime itself that captured the public's attention. It was the way it was reported, the way narratives were shaped, and the impact these portrayals had on the individuals involved. Media coverage can often make or break a story, and in this case, the coverage surrounding the CEO's actions would have far-reaching consequences. When the murder of the secretary first came to light, the media was quick to sensationalize the events. Breaking news reports painted a picture of a high-powered CEO, once revered as an icon of success and innovation, now caught in a scandal of unimaginable proportions. The public was stunned, and the media, always eager to capitalize on a story with dramatic elements, wasted no time in making the crime a spectacle. Headlines screamed of betrayal, murder, and the fall from grace of a once prominent business figure. The media's portrayal of events turned the CEO's actions into a larger-than-life narrative, transforming the story into an intricate web of intrigue, secrets, and moral decay. One of the most significant ways the media shaped the public's perception was by framing the story in terms of a battle between good and evil. The CEO, who had once been seen as a hero in the tech industry, was now portrayed as a villain. The media's focus shifted to his personal flaws, his extramarital affair, and the subsequent murder of his secretary, painting him as a man corrupted by power and desperation. This framing created a stark contrast between the CEO's past image as a visionary leader and his present reality as a criminal, a traitor to those who had placed their trust in him. The media coverage also took a deep dive into the affair between the CEO and his secretary. In many respects, the affair itself became almost as important as the murder. It was the catalyst for everything that followed. The affair allowed the media to build a narrative of deception, betrayal, and a double life. The CEO was no longer just a successful businessman. He was someone who had misled his wife, his employees, and even his investors. The affair added a layer of complexity to the story, portraying the CEO as a man driven by lust, ambition, and a desire to maintain control over both his personal and professional worlds. The media, however, was not entirely focused on the CEO's actions. The victim, the secretary, also became the subject of intense scrutiny. In many ways, the way the media handled her portrayal was just as important as how it framed the CEO. The secretary, who had been an ordinary employee in a high-stakes world, was now thrust into the spotlight. Her image was carefully curated by the press, with journalists painting a picture of a woman caught up in the chaos of a workplace romance. While some outlets treated her death with the gravity it deserved, others seemed more interested in sensationalizing her role in the affair. The media often depicted her as both a victim of circumstance and a woman who had knowingly entered into a dangerous relationship. This duality in her portrayal made her story even more compelling and added an element of intrigue to the already complex narrative. In addition to shaping public perception of the individuals involved, the media also played a significant role in influencing the legal proceedings that followed. The story was so widely covered that it became nearly impossible for those involved, whether jurors, lawyers, or the general public, not to form opinions based on what had already been reported. The constant coverage of the case affected how people viewed the trial. The CEO, now a convicted murderer, had already been judged in the court of public opinion long before the trial even began. The media had already branded him as a criminal, and the legal proceedings were seen by many as a mere formality. As the trial progressed, media coverage continued to dominate. Every detail of the trial was dissected by reporters, from the defense's arguments to the prosecution's strategy. Journalists often framed the legal process in dramatic terms, focusing on the emotional aspects of the case. The media followed the trial closely, running live updates, interviews with legal experts, and courtroom sketches. Some outlets even went so far as to present the trial as a battle between right and wrong, with the CEO representing the forces of corruption and greed, while the prosecution stood as the defenders of justice. The media's portrayal of the trial set the tone for public expectations, which often had little to do with the facts of the case and more to do with the emotional reaction of the audience. Social media, too, played a significant role in shaping public perception of the scandal. As the case unfolded, hashtags related to the CEO's murder trended across platforms. People discussed the details of the crime, debated the morality of the CEO's actions, and offered their opinions on what punishment he should receive. Social media amplified the emotional intensity of the situation, with people sharing their thoughts and reactions in real time. Public opinion became more polarized, with some supporting the CEO, citing his former accomplishments, while others condemned him outright, focusing on the brutality of the crime. The narrative constructed by the media was powerful, but it was also fluid. In many respects, the media was constantly reshaping the story to maintain public interest. As new developments emerged, the press adapted its coverage to reflect the changing nature of the case. This dynamic approach to storytelling kept the scandal in the public eye for months, ensuring that it remained a topic of conversation long after the initial shock had worn off. The constant media presence made it difficult for anyone involved, whether the CEO's family, the employees at his company, or the general public, to escape the weight of the scandal. The media's role extended beyond simply reporting the facts. It also set the agenda for how the public would interpret the events. Through its choice of language, framing of the narrative, and selective focus on certain details, the media shaped the way the public understood the motivations behind the murder. The press concentrated on the emotional aspects of the crime, focusing on the betrayal, the affair, and the CEO's shattered image. In doing so, the media turned what could have been a more complex, nuanced story into a tale of simple morality. The CEO was painted as the villain, the secretary as the victim, and the murder as the inevitable result of a man's desire to protect his empire at all costs. However, the media's framing was not without its critics. Some argued that the press had sensationalized the story to such an extent that it became less about the tragedy of a human life lost and more about creating a spectacle. Critics contended that the media's focus on the affair and the CEO's character flaws overshadowed the deeper issues at play, such as the systemic problems within corporate culture and the pressures faced by employees in high-powered environments. Some also felt that the media's treatment of the victim was unfair, as she was often reduced to a supporting character in a narrative centered around the CEO's downfall. In the aftermath, the media's portrayal of the CEO's actions would continue to influence how people viewed him, the tech industry, and corporate leaders in general. The scandal became a touchstone for debates about power, ethics, and accountability in the business world. The media's role in shaping these conversations was undeniable. By focusing on the dramatic aspects of the case, the media ensured that the story would be remembered not only as a tragedy, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dark side of ambition and the dangers of unchecked power. The media's involvement in the case underscores the crucial role it plays in shaping public perception, often turning real-life events into larger-than-life stories that transcend the facts. Through its ability to influence emotions, focus attention, and frame narratives, the media helped create a storyline that would resonate for years to come. The legacy of Scandal, in many ways, is a testament to the power of media in crafting the narratives we consume, and it serves as a reminder of how easily public opinion can be molded by the way stories are told. Before we talk about the psychological impact on the CEO and how it shaped his decision-making, it's important to understand the intense pressure and unique challenges that individuals in positions of immense power often face. The world of a CEO, particularly in the high-stakes tech industry, is one filled with constant demands, impossible expectations, and relentless competition. These individuals are not only tasked with steering multimillion-dollar companies to success, but also with maintaining an image of control, power, and invulnerability. Yet, behind the facade of the successful CEO lies a person who may be struggling with a multitude of personal and professional pressures. In the case of the CEO who murdered his secretary, we see an extreme example of how the psychological toll of this pressure can manifest. The events surrounding the crime cannot be fully understood without considering the psychological state of the individual involved. At first glance, it might seem like an incomprehensible act, one driven by pure malice or greed. However, when viewed through the lens of a psychological challenge CEOs face, it becomes clearer how a combination of factors, stress, guilt, fear, and a sense of desperation, may have contributed to his fateful decision. One of the key psychological factors at play is the overwhelming sense of isolation that often accompanies positions of extreme power. As a CEO, especially in a high-profile company, there is little room for vulnerability. The pressure to maintain an image of confidence and control can lead to a deep sense of loneliness. In many cases, CEOs find themselves surrounded by people who only serve their own interests, leaving the CEO with few genuine, supportive relationships. This sense of isolation can breed anxiety, stress, and a distorted view of the world around them. The CEO, in this case, may have felt cornered, with no one to turn to for advice or emotional support, and no outlet for the overwhelming pressure that came with his position. This isolation likely exacerbated the feelings of guilt and fear that were already present due to his extramarital affair. The affair itself was a manifestation of his need to assert control over his personal life, a life that was otherwise dictated by business demands and public scrutiny. The CEO's affair was not merely an act of infidelity, but also a way for him to seek validation and attention outside the confines of his professional life. It allowed him to feel desired and in control, something that may have been increasingly difficult in a world where his every move was watched and scrutinized. Psychologically, infidelity can lead to feelings of shame, fear of exposure, and the constant need to protect the secret. For someone in the CEO's position, the stakes of such an affair were even higher. The fear of being exposed, of losing everything, the family, the career, the image, would have been magnified by the pressure to uphold his public persona as a successful leader. This fear likely fueled a growing sense of desperation. The CEO's relationship with his secretary, which was initially a source of validation, soon became a dangerous liability. In his mind, the affair was no longer a mere indiscretion, but something that could unravel everything he had worked for, from his marriage to his position at the helm of the company. As the affair began to unravel, the psychological pressure on the CEO mounted. The constant fear of exposure, coupled with the guilt of betrayal, would have heightened his sense of anxiety. In many ways, the CEO's sense of reality may have become distorted. The need to protect his secret, to maintain control over both his personal and professional life, likely became all-consuming. The fear of public humiliation, the loss of his career, and the disgrace that would follow if his affair were to come to light likely clouded his judgment. The CEO may have felt trapped, seeing no way out other than to eliminate the one person who could expose his secret. The decision to murder his secretary can, in part, be understood as a desperate attempt to regain control. The act itself reflects a deep psychological breakdown. Murder, in this case, may not have been driven by the desire to harm, but rather by the CEO's distorted sense of survival. In his mind, the only way to protect himself from the catastrophic consequences of his actions was to silence the threat, his secretary. The psychological toll of living in constant fear and guilt, coupled with the pressure to uphold his public image, likely pushed him to make a decision that he might never have considered under different circumstances. The act was not one of clear-headed rational thinking, but rather a manifestation of overwhelming stress, fear, and desperation. The CEO's decision-making process leading up to the murder was undoubtedly influenced by his psychological state. Decision-making, especially under pressure, is often clouded by emotions such as fear, anger, and guilt. In high-pressure situations, the brain can prioritize short-term solutions, ones that alleviate immediate anxiety, over more logical, long-term decisions. In the case of the CEO, the overwhelming pressure to conceal the affair and protect his career likely led to a breakdown in his ability to think rationally. In his mind, the risk of exposure far outweighed any other consideration, and this led to the catastrophic decision to silence the one person who could bring everything crashing down. Additionally, the CEO's sense of power and entitlement likely played a significant role in his decision-making. Psychologically, individuals in positions of extreme power often develop a sense of invincibility. Over time, they may come to believe that the rules do not apply to them, that their actions will be excused or overlooked due to their status. This sense of entitlement, combined with the CEO's isolation and anxiety, likely led him to believe that he could act without consequence. His ability to make decisions in a high-pressure environment may have been compromised by this inflated sense of power, blinding him to the reality that his actions could have irreversible consequences. It's also important to consider the concept of cognitive dissonance. When a person experiences mental discomfort due to holding two conflicting beliefs or behaviors, the CEO, on one hand, likely saw himself as a successful, ethical leader, yet on the other, he was engaging in an affair and ultimately committing murder. The need to reconcile these two conflicting aspects of his identity could have led to further psychological turmoil. In order to alleviate this dissonance, the CEO may have rationalized his actions, convincing himself that he had no other choice, that the affair had to be kept secret at all costs. This rationalization process, often unconscious, would have further clouded his ability to make a rational decision, as he justified the murder as the only viable solution to his problem. As the murder investigation progressed, the psychological impact on the CEO likely deepened. The stress of being investigated, the guilt of his actions, and the fear of the consequences would have intensified his psychological struggles. The CEO, now facing the prospect of being caught and potentially convicted, would have found it increasingly difficult to maintain the calm, composed exterior that he had once cultivated. The psychological toll of the crime would have been all-consuming, likely contributing to his eventual breakdown. Throughout this ordeal, the CEO's decision-making was profoundly influenced by the psychological pressures he faced. His mental state, characterized by isolation, guilt, fear, and a need for control shaped the decisions he made, leading to actions that would forever alter the course of his life. It's crucial to understand that the CEO's behavior was not simply a result of malice or a calculated desire for power. Rather, it was the culmination of intense psychological distress and a breakdown in rational decision-making. The murder, in this context, was the tragic outcome of an individual who, under the crushing weight of fear and guilt, made a decision that defied all reason and morality. To summarize the key points of his tragic case, we've seen how a series of personal and professional pressures led a once prominent CEO to make a devastating decision. His secret affair, the mounting stress of maintaining a perfect public image, and his overwhelming fear of exposure ultimately drove him to murder his secretary in a desperate attempt to cover up the truth. The psychological toll of living under constant pressure and isolation played a critical role in shaping his decision-making, leading to a catastrophic chain of events. This case serves as a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the destructive effects of fear and guilt, and the extreme lengths to which some people will go to protect their reputations. It's a sobering reflection on the fragility of human nature and the consequences of letting personal issues spiral out of control. If you found this story both shocking and insightful, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of real-life events. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories to light. Thank you for watching.